Good morning. Welcome to The Human Author. My name is Jen Cantwell, and today I'm going to be reading chapter 24 in my current book, The Warning. If you'd like to learn more about it, as well as the series, which is called Light Chaser, you can visit my website at jbcantwell.com. So I'm going to go ahead and read. I am right now just doing one chapter a week because we are moving and I need a little extra time. Okay, so here we go. I'd been so focused on making it to our destination that I hadn't been paying close attention to our route. I'd been directing my attention to Adair and his path toward the wall. Oriana's family lived close to the gates, and now that we had the offer of her mother's help, I felt confused. Hadn't she been the one who'd chased me away more times than I could count? Hadn't she been the one to blame me for her daughter's death? Well, if that were true, then it was a feeling we shared, for I had long been of the opinion that if her mother had only allowed me to help, my best friend would still be alive today. Still, I followed without comment. I wasn't sure what this woman had in mind. Perhaps she was after the silver herself, but I couldn't know either way. Kenneth came up behind me, taking one of my hands in his and whispering in my ear, "Who is this woman? Can we trust her?" I looked back at Adair, prompting him to ask the same question, but of himself. "I don't know this woman," he said, watching her as her face shifted and showed her frustration. "But you do. It's up to you." He looked around, nervously taking in the many people who were now wandering the streets in search of me. I didn't ask Kenneth or Brennan what they thought. There wasn't always time for a vote, so I took the opportunity, hoping the others would follow. "Show us the way," I whispered. She turned away, slinking along the side of her house, opening the gate in the garden and rushing to the door. Moments later, we were inside, and a rush of memory flooded through me. I nearly started to cry, remembering the loss of Oriana, the best friend I'd ever had. But then I pushed my emotions down deep and prepared to fight her, just in case that was her intention. Something told me it wasn't, though. The house was dark, not a single candle lit. Once we were all inside and the door shut tightly behind us, she turned. "Good," she said. "There's a way into the city under this house, carved out by whoever lived here before us. We found it by accident, but I think it's safe. Before we had our children, my husband and I made the journey through the tunnel, so we know where it leads. There's an out-of-the-way alley on the other side of the wall. If you choose to take this route, you will come up in an area largely forgotten, or at least ignored." I looked back at my friends, their faces filled with fear. But given the situation we were in, I figured they would be frightened regardless. At least now we were safe in the house, at least for the time being. I turned back to her, suspicious. "And why should I trust you after all that time when you knew that keeping me away from her was killing her? For all I know, you'll just turn us in." In the darkness, with only a sliver of moon coming through the window, her face fell. "You don't understand. I need you. That's why I'm offering to help." Of course, that was why. They'd only ever been greedy, unwilling to spend their money and treasures on Oriana's treatment. Whether or not they had ever tried an elixir from Zahn, in the end, they'd chosen to let her die without letting me help her to live. I crossed my arms. "What do you want?" "It's Bran. You remember him, right? Oriana's little brother." I frowned. "Of course I do." "Well, he's sick, just like his sister, and we are out of money. We don't know what to do. Heal him and I'll show you the way inside." "Of course that's the reason," I said. "You're a terrible woman. All those years I tried to help you, and you may as well have been shooing me away from your house with a broom." "I'm sorry," she said, but you never did anything to help, and now you want me to help you again? Why should I?" I couldn't see very well in the darkness, but I could hear her sniffling and knew she was crying. "Come with me," she said, "and I'll show you." I looked back at the others, but the longer we were in her house and the fact that she hadn't yet raised the alarm, the more safe I felt. The irony of the situation was not lost on me, though, for I had never once been welcomed into this place. "Please," she begged, her voice a whisper, "you don't have to help, but please just meet him." "You guys stay here and keep guard," I said to the others. Then I turned back to her. "Where is your husband?" Her sniffling began again, and when she spoke, it seemed impossible for her to put the words together. Was he dead? Had Zahn figured out that I'd helped their daughter all those years? Or was he maybe lying in wait? Regardless, my interest was piqued, and the possibility of an easy way into the center of the city was too tantalizing for me to ignore. "5 minutes," I said, "and if I'm not back, you can expect these three to be on their way after you." She nodded and turned to walk up the stairs. "You didn't answer my question," I said. "All you need to know is that he's not a danger to you anymore." "Is he dead?" It was, perhaps, a crass question, but I felt I needed to know. "No, but he's no longer here. He left me after Brand fell ill. He took all of our money and left the city. It seems that even after watching his daughter die, he was unwilling to help with his only son." Something about this news did not surprise me. Sure, I'd had a couple of good experiences with men, even boys, but the scenario of the father leaving the child behind was familiar to me. For some reason, this news made me hate Oriana's mother a little bit less. I wondered how he'd done it. Had they fought, or had he just slunk away in the night like a coward? These were questions I wanted answers to, but before I had a chance to ask them, I found her leading me into the same room where Oriana had died. I stopped at the threshold as memories of Oriana flooded my mind. Her pale, white skin, hot with fever, her never-ending cough and the blood it produced, the weakness of her body as I picked her up and brought her back into the house after we'd fought in the yard. She'd been ready to go, ready to leave me. Certainly she'd given more thought to her own death than even I had, and I'd given it plenty. It was as I watched the life drain out of her eyes that I realized we would never speak again, never travel to the places we had dreamed we would go. At first, I was hesitant to walk into the room, to experience that place of death again. Her mother had assured me that Oriana's father was gone for good, but I knew what it meant to have a bounty on my head, and I entered cautiously, looking around in every shadowy corner for that hulking man. Then I heard it, a muffled cry that could only come from a small child. Oriana hadn't spoken much about her little brother, Bran. Maybe she'd been too distracted by her own illness to give him much thought. The last time I'd seen him, he'd had some sort of hot grain smashed over his face. He was just a little one. But there he was, visible in the scant moonlight. And while it could have been the cool light of the night that made him look so pale, I somehow doubted it. He was ill, very ill. I crossed the room to him, unable to stop myself, but I was horrified when I saw the look on his face, for he looked just like his sister, only his sister hadn't acted scared, and this little boy was. His eyes were wide as I approached, but he didn't pull away. Maybe he didn't even have the energy to do so. I turned back to his mother. "May I sit with him?" She nodded, and I could see the tears running down her face. She'd lost everything, everything but this little boy and the roof over her head. Even that was at risk. I sat down cautiously on the side of the bed. "Hey, little man," I said. "I'm Bree. I'm here to help you. So your mom tells me you're not feeling well." He didn't answer. I turned to his mother. Does he talk? Come on, Bran. You can tell her how you feel. Slowly, he opened his mouth to speak, but before he had a chance to utter a single word, a fresh volley of coughs began to rattle in his chest. It took him a few minutes to get it under control, and then, once he could breathe again, he looked at me. Hurts, he said. I didn't doubt it. You know, your sister Oriana and I used to be very good friends. Do you remember her? He didn't answer, didn't move, and I recalled a time when I'd once been sick. I'd coughed so loudly and violently that I hadn't wanted to speak either. I didn't ask him any more questions and simply put my palms over his chest. Then, with everything I had, I pulsed healing energy through him. His eyes were wide as he felt the cleansing that I knew only healing magic could produce. Magic or light. I gave him all that I had to offer, everything I could manage that wouldn't result in the weakness I would face if I were to continue. Slowly, I pulled my hands away from his chest. He sat up cautiously in the bed. How do you feel? I asked him, and I was delighted when a smile came to his face. There was a drop, though, a single drop of blood that dripped down the side of his mouth. It concerned me. Had it not been enough? I turned to his mother. I'm sorry, but I think this is all I can do. I can rest and try again in a little while. Maybe what I've given him is enough to save him, but I can't be sure. The little boy jumped from the bed as if he were a child excited for a party. Then he ran to his mother and gripped onto her leg, wrapping his arms around it and staring back at me shyly. Mama, he said quietly. She looked down at him, the tears of sadness changing to tears of gratefulness. What is it, love? He shook his head, then gestured for her to come down to his level. When she did, he whispered something in her ear. She looked at him intently when he quieted, and he turned back to face me. His mother stood. He says he wants you to stay, she said, a tone of helplessness in her voice. I smiled and looked down at the boy. I can't stay, little man, but I will come see you again. His face fell. But then he released his mother's leg and walked up to me, beckoning for me to bend over as his mother had. Then he cupped his hand around my ear and whispered the words I so longed to hear and so rarely did. Thank you. A few minutes later, with Bran still messing about, we all sat around the small dining table downstairs. At first, his mother had tried to get him to sleep, but it had become clear that he'd been sick for many days and probably sequestered to his bed. Now that he was well, he clearly had no desire to rest anymore. He was also unwilling to be strapped into his baby chair, and his mother seemed so delighted at his newfound health that she let him toddle around us. After he'd made the rounds a couple of times, he stopped in front of me. Pick me, he said, holding up his arms. Clearly, he wanted to be with me. What a strange feeling that someone so young who had been so scared of me just half an hour before desired nothing more now than to sit on my lap. I leaned over and looked him in the eye. Then I lit my forefinger with flame, and his face brightened at the trick. I can do all kinds of things, I said quietly. Then I extinguished the flame and picked him up, his knees resting upon my thighs as he looked me straight in the face. His smile was contagious, even in the darkness, even though he reminded me of the sister I would never see again. I smiled back at him, and he put both palms against my cheeks, then squeezed them hard until my mouth puckered like a fish. He released my cheeks, then smacked them hard once more. It surprised me, and I almost yelped, but instead I grabbed onto his wrists to keep him from doing it again. At first, he looked unhappy, almost like he was about to cry, but then I inflated my cheeks so that I looked like a big balloon. At this, he laughed, then tucked his head and smashed it into my chest, giggling. He's got spunk, just like she did. I wondered what this little brother might have been like on a journey with his sister and me. Not a baby, of course, but maybe as a young man. I hoped he would keep a measure of his humor as he grew up in such a difficult time. I looked up at his mother. I don't know how long it will last, I said. I'm guessing there's no more light in the markets, right? She shook her head, wrapping her hands around a mug of hot tea. Not for months and months. After losing Oriana, we were willing to try anything, but it wasn't long before all of the chasers were imprisoned. I'm afraid your father was the first to go, and he didn't even have anything. I frowned. How do you know that? Did you speak with him? I did. I was wondering where you'd gone. Why? To tell you how sorry I was about the way we treated you all those years. Tears were running down her cheeks again. And I looked down at the hands in my lap and tried not to cry myself. We were terrible to you, and all you ever wanted was to help her. I shook my head, suddenly understanding both sides of our conflict. You would have been imprisoned and Oriana dead sooner if you'd allowed me to. Bree, you know that's not true, she said. We could have snuck you in, or maybe taken Oriana to see you where you live, or lived. I'm afraid there's not much left to it now. Anyway, it was a mistake. She didn't speak again, just watched as her teardrops fell into the mug. The silence that hung in the air was deafening, and it didn't take long for Kenneth to speak up. Where do we go from here? He asked. How do we get in? She looked out the window, then stood up and walked over to it, putting her tea down on the small counter. Are there many? She held up her hand, then put one finger to her lips as she listened. Finally, she turned back. There are many people out still, but I think that's a good thing. It will be harder for them to target you where there are so many other faces to investigate. Besides, the sun will be up soon enough. She crossed the room, then raised up her hands, shooing us away from the table. Get up, she said. I'll show you the way. I'm sure you can get in, but I don't know where exactly you'll land. The kids never knew about this passageway, and even my husband didn't understand the full extent of the tunnel. I inherited this house from my parents, and when I was a child, I investigated the tunnel, but only once. I took a beating for it, and I never tried it again. Once we were all standing, she indicated for Kenneth to help her lift the table. Together they quietly moved it across the floor. Immediately, she got down on all fours and pulled up the dirty old rug that lay beneath the table. I still didn't see anything, though. The wood was smooth with age, and there was no indication of any kind of door. For a moment, I thought she might be tricking us, but then she spoke. It's right under here, she grunted, her fingers looking for the spot. And there, practically invisible, was a tiny strip of wood that she pushed her fingers behind as she began to pull up the floorboards. A little help? Brennan was closest, and he helped her heave the long slats of wood up off the floor until we were staring down at a pit. She sat back, breathless. It's right down there, she said. I don't have any torches, but, well, I suppose you do. I saw what you did with Bran. I nodded. The sky outside was lightening, and it was a little easier to see her face. I recalled that she'd once been quite beautiful, not unlike her daughter, but now she looked as if she'd aged 20 years since I'd last seen her. I supposed that losing a daughter and husband, and then almost a son, had encouraged those tired, stressed lines upon her skin. I didn't like the woman, but I did understand her better than I had before. How do we know you won't tell anyone? Kenneth asked. He'd been surprisingly quiet during our meeting with her, but now it seemed his caution was returning. But Oriana's mother wasn't about to give up so fast. It will only take you an hour to make it underneath the city, maybe less. And if I'd wanted to turn you in for the bounty on your heads, I would have done it right away. Still, my reasons for helping you were selfish. She looked over at Bran. So please, if I may ask for one other favor, please bring us back some light so that we can heal him for good. And while you're at it, kill that man up in the tower. We've all had enough of him. I caught her eye. And suddenly, the hatred I'd felt for this woman for so long melted away. She and I were not so unalike. We'd both been abandoned, both lost a young girl, and now we both wanted the same thing, revenge. I will, I promised, and I let my legs dangle above the opening, finally scooting myself to the edge and dropping down into the tunnel, murder on my mind. Okay. That's all I have for today. If you'd like to learn more about this series, you can visit jbcantwell.com. And if you have any questions about The Human Author, you can email me, jen@thehumanauthor.com. I'll be back here again next Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific, and I hope to see you then. Have a good weekend.